Hello everyone, and welcome to today's live broadcast, Aquaculture and Biomedical Research of Non-Traditional Aquatics. I'm Brenda Kelly Kim, and I'll be your moderator from Lab Roots for today's event. We have a few important announcements before we begin. This webcast is designed to be interactive, and we encourage you to ask questions during the event. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found by clicking on the green Q&A button at the lower left of the presentation window. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the screen icon in the lower right-hand corner of the slide window. If you have any technical problems viewing or hearing this presentation, please click on the support button at the top right of your presentation window, or submit your question through the green Q&A button lower left. Would now like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Dan Rothen received his DVM from the University of Florida. He has been a clinical veterinarian at the University of Miami for 11 years. Here, he serves as a more traditional laboratory animal veterinarian, while still maintaining veterinary responsibility for the university's aquaculture programs and non-human primate medicine and surgery. He also consults with aquaculture facilities throughout South Florida, including coral restoration projects at the Mote Marine Laboratory in Summerlin, Florida. I will now turn it over to Dr. Rothen for his presentation.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. A couple things I'd like to say thank you to Bioconference Live and Lab Roots for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you guys today, particularly Rachel, Don, and Brenda, who've been very patient and helped me with some technical support. Appreciate that. And before I get started, I want to encourage everybody to also view the webinar by Dr. Juan Ramos. It was earlier today on fish welfare, stress, pathology, handling, and managing. I found it to be very complementary to the talk that I'm going to give today. So I highly recommend that you watch that as well. It was well done, and a lot of the same sort of ideas are covered today that in my slides that he covered as well. Like I said, today's talk is on aquaculture and biomedical research of non-traditional aquatics. So no zebrafish and no xenopus will be discussed in this presentation for the most part. I'm from the University of Miami, Division of Veterinary Resources, and the picture you see on the first slide is just a couple of days ago down in the Florida Keys, and I just wanted to let everybody know what February in South Florida looks like. So our objectives for today's presentation will be to highlight unique issues when using these uncommon aquatic species. We want to talk about some thoughts on planning and design of aquatic facilities, and some of the challenges that we have in staying compliant with regulations and some suggestions that are created for other species. As you know, the newest edition, the 8th edition of the Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals, along with the 2013 edition of the AVMA Guidelines for Euthanasia, have a much larger commentary about aquatics and aquatic use. But for the most part, those are written for our traditional species. So there are some challenges with some of these unique species to stay compliant with regulations that maybe were created for other situations. And we'll talk a little bit about oversight and management from the veterinary side and from the technical side. So the first question I always like to ask people, say, fish are fish, right? And the answer to that is, of course, no. The Census of Marine Life has estimated that there's 250,000 marine organisms already described and 750,000 yet to be described. So it's quite a variation. And in freshwater and brackish water, approximately 126,000 species have been described. So there's lots and lots of variation. One of my big pet peeves and something that you'll see all the time is in big box pet stores. And this picture kind of highlights my pet peeve, if you will. All of these fish in big box pet stores are on the same aquatic system. They're on a recirculating system. However, in this picture you can see on the left are some nice assorted African cichlids, and on the right are some Central American cichlids. So the African cichlids typically prefer hard water and a higher pH whereas the Central American cichlids would prefer a lower pH and a softer water condition. But in the big box pet store, they're all in the same water, so I'm not sure anybody's really happy in that situation. And a lot of times aquarists and hobbyists kind of get confused with thriving versus surviving. So these fish can certainly survive in this water, but we want our research animals and our aquatics to really thrive. So it's going to be important to really understand the fish that we use. So when we talk about strategic planning, the first thing, like everything else, location, location, location. We're also going to talk about emergency plans and then a catastrophe plan and kind of what the difference between those two things is. We'll talk a little bit about water source and where we can get water for our animals, and where are we going to get our feeds, and what kind of different variations in feed sources we have available to us. And then again, where do you get your animals? I mean, it's not too difficult to acquire Xenopus and Zebrafish, but some more exotic species may be a bit of a challenge to acquire. And then some other things to think about is study duration versus infrastructure. Is it worth spending hundreds of thousands of dollars building a facility for a short-term study or maybe a single PI? And there's some different options on how to handle that. When we talk about location, coastal facilities have a great advantage because we have an unending supply of seawater. It's very helpful. But that raises some other issues. How do you get water from the ocean to your animal housing, or from a large lake to your animal housing, however you are? And then, say you can get water, how do you filter it? And then, do you know that the incoming water is safe, and will it stay safe? You can test it in one part of the year, and then test it a different part of the year, and perhaps some values have changed. We know that temperature has a big effect, and in our case, we have a lot of storms that pass through South Florida, so that can churn up some things in the bottom of the water and change our water quality issues. So it's something that you have to kind of figure out how to keep that water safe for our animals. And then a big one for us is what to do with the outgoing saltwater, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a few moments. So like I said, coastal locations are advantageous. This is the University of Miami's marine campus. This is the hatchery side, and you can see in the distance, that's Biscayne Bay, and there's plenty of salt water for all we could possibly use. And those are the tops of our tanks and vats for our systems. When it comes to emergency plans, first of all, do you have one? Oftentimes we go on to talk about having power backup, because that's one of the first things that goes when we have a problem. And then when the power goes, a lot of other things go, including water pumps and temperature regulation, things like that. Oxygen is a little bit easier because we can run oxygen through tanks and through an air stone, and that doesn't require electricity. But it's still good to have some oxygen on hand in the event of a short-term emergency. And then what do you do with carcasses? This is a big issue with large fish. Zebrafish are pretty small. Sorry, I said I wouldn't talk about zebrafish, but we have some other small fish that we use. But when you're dealing with a 20-kilogram mahi-mahi or something like that, you can't just dispose of that carcass in the municipal trash. If that animal has been euthanized with MS222, then it is a problem. So we typically treat the big fish like we would a swine or other large animals, and have those incinerated by a private company. We do not allow those to go into municipal waste, and we do not leave them out for other animals to come across. And one thing when it comes to emergency, and this is something that I harp on with all hobbyists as well, is having redundancy. If you have one filter on your system and it happens to go kaput, now you're in a lot of trouble. So it's oftentimes advantageous to have a redundant system, so that way if one filter crashes, you still have time with your other filter running to keep the system in gear. This is kind of the backside of our hatchery setup, you can see there's multiple water pumps and sand filters and all kinds of plumbing. And the question is, do you have backup for that? You know, all of those things require power. Those water pumps require power, and it's really important that you have backup power available, or something to accommodate you should you run out of power or have one of those pumps break. So then, kind of on a grander scale, is a catastrophe plan. And another thing, do you have one? We have one because we have lots of hurricanes that either hit us directly or try to scare us a little bit. But you know, catastrophes can be fires, floods, earthquakes. It's all over the country, so nobody's really immune to having some catastrophic event happen at their facility. One option is to move animals. You know, we're very fortunate with hurricanes that we have typically a few days or even a week's notice. So we can have joint agreements with related facilities across the state, both north and west of us. So depending on the track of the storm, we would be able to move some large animals, or large fishes, I should say, to other facilities should we have an impending hurricane. And there's not many facilities south of us because we're at the bottom of Florida, but we do have some agreements with related facilities. And you should also talk about worst case scenarios. What happens if your entire facility gets obliterated and gets flattened? That's a big concern, and I'll show a picture in a moment of how that can happen. You should also identify who your first responder team is. In the event that you know, some of these unexpected things like fires and floods or earthquakes happen, you know, who's going to be the first one to go check on those animals? Now, you know, at the University of Miami, we have a hurricane team that goes into effect every hurricane season, so we're pretty good about that. But you know, you just want to make sure you identify those individuals so that way there is no problems should one of those emergencies happen or catastrophes happen. And then the final thing, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation, is species selection. Because if your outdoor facility happens to get flattened and all of your fish gets swept out to sea, well, that's kind of an important thing because we want to make sure that we're not introducing species that aren't supposed to be there. And we'll talk about that as well. Some of you can remember Hurricane Andrew in 1992. I promise you, if you lived anywhere in Florida, you really remember Hurricane Andrew of 1992. In this picture, you can see it hit pretty close to Miami. We were very fortunate in the sense that it hit about 30 miles south of our aquatic facility. It still did a considerable amount of damage. And we also had some other large animal facilities down south that sustained significant damage. And certainly the people that lived down there you know, went through catastrophic damage. But it's not that hard for a storm to come and hit us directly. So it can happen. It happened in 1992. And I wouldn't be surprised if it happens in the next few years. So it's important to have all of these things planned out and strategized. When we talk about species selection, it's important to consider when we're planning for these catastrophic events. Like I said, we want to make sure that we don't release any invasive or non-native species due to accidental release. It's somewhat analogous to the Florida Everglades python problem, which I'm sure most people across the country have heard about and know about. It's a butt of a lot of jokes, but it's a real big problem here. And it's not just pythons, it's lots of other things, other reptiles, fishes, plants, you know, you name it, everything grows in Florida. So it's really important that you're careful with the species that you select. And of course, there are non-native invasive species that live all over the country. You know, people want to do research on snakeheads or something like that. You want to make sure that those facilities are nowhere near natural waterways because those fishes can be very, very dangerous when they get into those waterways. So local species are always preferable, but if your researcher or investigator wants to use you know, something like a snakehead or something, then you just have to make sure that there's no way that that animal could make it into a natural waterway. Some extra barriers for outdoor facilities, just even some fencing can help. Now, I'm not saying that a fence is going to stand up to Hurricane Andrew, but it certainly can help should there be a large tank that ruptures or something like that in the middle of the night. It doesn't even have to take an emergency. Sometimes shifts in the ground can be enough to crack an 18-ton vat or an 18-ton tank, and if that happens, you can actually get fish release. So fences help keep the fish inside the facility instead of into the waterway. Obviously, it's not good for the fish, but it's good for the ecosystem. You can also have outflow pumps, filters, and wells, and that's how we do a lot of our outflow, so as to prevent accidental release of species and things like that. So this is a picture I took while down in the Keys, and these are just a number of common fishes that are caught in Monroe County bridges. I mean, there's a million of them, so there's lots of opportunities for marine research when you're on the coast. I mean, there's groupers and snappers and pompano and hogfish and mackerel and triggerfish. So there's lots and lots of native species, at least in South Florida, that can be used for research in an outdoor facility. And so it's important to know what exactly is in your area and try to use those species, or try to encourage researchers to use those species. One thing you may or may not have heard about, and we'll talk about a little bit more, is our good friend, the lionfish. And this has become a real big problem here in South Florida due to unintentional release. And there's some debate as to where it came from, but as somebody who's dived the Florida Keys for most of my life, I can say that I hadn't seen them at all, ever, outside of a pet store up until a few years ago. And now it's very common. Probably every other dive you're going to see one or two or more. So this is a new problem in South Florida, and we'll talk a little bit about more of that in just a moment. When we talk about water sources, like I said, location is helpful, but it's not a deal breaker. There's lots of different sources of marine water. Preferably is natural, just from the cost perspective, but you can reconstitute marine water. There's lots of salts available, and you can create a marine environment just like the hobbyists do in your own facility. So there's no reason that you couldn't be, far, far from the coast, maybe in the Midwest or something like that, and still run a high-quality marine research system. It just might be a little bit more costly. So it's one of those things that you should add into your budget, because creating your own saltwater gets pricey. Now, when we talk about freshwater systems, it's pretty much the same options as a zebrafish facility. Again, I said I wouldn't mention that, but I'm doing it twice. You can have municipal water, reverse osmosis water, pretty much any water source that's freshwater you can create to be habitable for freshwater fish. You just need to know your species' optimal water quality and make sure that you match that. And like I said, it's very different. You've got some fish that like very hard water, very high pH water. And then you've got other more sensitive fish that like soft water and a low pH. So that's really important to know their optimal water quality parameters, because you're going to get the best data possible by having the best environment. So that's totally analogous to our mice and rats and other lab animal species, is trying to optimize everything in their environment. Lots of different water sources. For us here at the University of Miami, you can see in the background, that's a deep well that's pulling salt water from below the limestone. South Florida and most of Florida in general is sitting on a big piece of limestone rock, and that well goes really, really deep, and because it's so close to the coast, it actually pulls salt water that's pretty close in quality to the water that's in the bay right behind it. So the advantage of that is, because it's so deep, it's very unlikely to contain pathogens and things like that, because it's been filtered through the limestone. But like all deep wells, it's going to have high pressure gases, so there's a degassing component to it as well. But that picture is, like I said, a deep well pulling salt water for us, and we use that throughout our system. Other systems we have water intake directly from Biscayne Bay. And you can see on the upper left picture, there's some tubes that kind of run along the ground, and then they go out to a little stand where there's a bunch of cormorants drying their wings, and that's where we have water intake. And once the water gets pumped from that location, it goes into these settling vats, which you see on the bottom right, and it's a series of chambers where sediment can slowly fall out of solution, so by the time the water gets to the other end, it's pretty free of particulate matter. Now, it's not completely free, but it's considerably less than it is when it's first pumped in. And that's helpful because it prolongs the life of your filters. Because you know, the water that comes straight out of the bay with all the particulates and things is going to clog your filters pretty quickly. And so what you don't see in that picture is that there's another side of it, but I didn't take a picture because it was full of grad students shoveling up debris. So once in a while you gotta have them clean out all the stuff that has sunk from the water. Water outflow is also a real big concern. So we talked about, you know, getting water to your animals. Well, how do we get water away from our animals? And marine systems are more challenging. There's a couple of different things that we utilize here at the University of Miami. We have a natural release system that involves some filtration, some pumps, and then that water goes out to a designated area for natural release. I put in sewer system because depending on the amount of water that you're talking about, sewer system might be possible. But for the amount of water that we use at the university, it is not legal for us to use the sewer system for water effluent. The salt water just overwhelms the sewer system and overwhelms the reclamation and cleaning. But when you think about the water outflow, you got to think that water's not the only concern that you have. You've got hormones that could be used on these animals. You've got medications, perhaps. Our good friend MS-222. And then, of course, unintended release of non-native species and pathogens. So all of those things need to be thought about and planned about when you talk about outflow of water. You can't just go ahead and dump it back into the bay without some forethought and some potential different plumbing or some filtration systems. We also have a deep water well that we can have outflow into, so a lot of things get diluted before they would ever reach any living organism. But the take-home point for this slide is that it's absolutely critical to work with your environmental health and safety office and your local government so that you can ensure safe disposal of wastewater. The last thing you want to do is go through the trouble of developing a beautiful system and then have the county or the state tell you that you can't dispose of the water that you have now added into the system. So I touched on this a little bit earlier. We now have the Atlantic lionfish. This is an accidentally released species, and there's some various theories as to how that happened. I won't touch on that particularly here, but you can email me. We could chat about it if you like. But like I said, I never used to see them diving years ago, but now you see them all the time. In fact, down at Mote Marine Laboratory, and you can see there's one coming up on February the 7th, they have lionfish roundups or a lionfish derby. And it's a contest, and they have people go out, and they oftentimes get 500 lionfish in a day. It's really shocking to see 500 lionfish just kind of piled up and removed from the ocean in one day. It's really quite a sight to see, and I wish I had a picture of that. Unfortunately, when it comes to the lionfish, manual removal will never eradicate this species. As much as we want to try, it's not gonna be the be-all, end-all. Recent studies have found lionfish at waters that are deeper than traditional divers go. So the lionfish have learned how to get away from people. Here in the Atlantic, they're an apex predator. So the only thing that really gets them is humans. And like I said in the last point, fortunately, they're quite delicious. So that's a positive. So that'll encourage people to collect those and try to remove them. Just got to remember that the spines on top of the back are poisonous and will sting the heck out of you. But you can get around that. The meat is fabulous, and in fact, Reef.org and Mote Marine even have a lionfish cookbook, which you can get on Amazon or anywhere else. So there's lots of good recipes, and if you happen to take a vacation down to the Keys, you can oftentimes find lionfish on the menu, so that's kind of cool. When we talk about our research animals, when we talk about feed sources, there's some basic diets that are available commercially. Purina makes some, Missouri, Pentair Aquatic Ecosystems, Cargill, many, many more. But the question is, are they right for your species of choice? Here's a quick slide I took from the Purina website. They've got some fish feeds, and they've got starter feeds. They got fry powder. They've got some for pond fish, which I'm assuming are catfish type. And then they've got a sport fish diet. But what does that really mean, and is that adequate for the species that you choose? Very possibly it is. It could be absolutely perfect for what you need. But the bottom line is you need to decide and learn what you need for your species. Otherwise, you're giving them a suboptimal diet. But there are lots of options out there, and like I said, the big guns like Purina do make diets that could be very well used in most facilities. However, like I said, these diets are available, but they're very species dependent, especially when we're talking about marine fish, because there's so many species out there. As Dr. Ramos pointed out earlier today, we talk about herbivores, carnivores, omnivores. I didn't know the word for fish that eat coralvores, if you will. And a good example of that is a parrotfish. And a parrotfish is a gorgeous, beautiful tropical fish here that lives on the reefs. And when you dive, you hear them crunching coral all day long. And there's some debate as to whether or not they're actually eating the coral or if they're just crunching the coral to get to the algae that is inside. But nevertheless, if you had a researcher that wanted to use parrotfish, that's something you'd have to keep in mind and find a way to provide at least some coral material for them to crunch on. And that may be a big hassle, because corals aren't the easiest thing to get your hands on. And of course, we also got to talk about life stage, and this goes with all sorts of animals. First foods versus adult diets, and they're very different. Even our large fish start off as small, tiny fry, hatching from eggs, so they've got to be fed some of the same things that our other fish are fed as well at the very beginning. But once these fish grow into large fishes, which we'll see some videos of shortly, you've got to get bait type fish. To accommodate a large colony of cobia or mahi-mahi, you oftentimes have to use frozen bait type operations and get fish from them. So that's a little bit of a concern. Is it a biosecurity risk? Of course it is. And so that's a big problem, and it's something that we test for, and we're starting to do a lot more research in, because we don't know where Billy's Baits or any of these places are getting these fishes and squid from. They could be imported from Asia for all we know, so we want to make sure that we're not introducing exotic viral diseases or things like that. So that's something that we really got to think about, especially in large operations. So some examples of herbivores. Most people have heard of the grass carp, or the triploid grass carp, if you will. They are incredibly good at eating plants, which is why they're triploid, and they're released into waterways that are overgrown. But the triploid grass carp can't reproduce, so the same number you put in should be the same number you could take out, and they do a tremendous job. And as you can see in the picture on the right, they get huge, and a fish like that can mow down quite a lot of vegetation very quickly. But they don't have to be giant carp. Even this beautiful yellow-eyed coal tang on the bottom is an herbivore, and it's just important to know that that thing needs a lot of vegetative matter as well. Carnivores are also commonly used, and they don't always have to be scary sharks. These are images from one of our shark research programs here at the University of Miami, the R.J. Dunlap Marine Conservation Program. and we do a lot of shark research, but carnivores don't all come in scary shapes like these. You can have everything from the little piranha on the left. He's got a fish in his mouth. Same thing with the Oscar on the right. He's got a fish in his mouth. Now, the good thing is a fish like an Oscar can easily be trained to take a pelleted diet, so that makes life a lot easier. But fish on the bottom is a peacock bass, and that is it's not native to South Florida, but it's one of the few species that's been introduced by the state to control the release of exotic species. It has some very strict temperature limits, so it can't really escape and go much past South Florida. So they have been stocked in a lot of the canals to avoid people dumping pet fish into the canal, because they do quite a good job of removing them. They also are a lot of fun to go fishing for. So those guys probably would have a harder time going onto a pelleted diet. I would say that those are probably going to have to eat live feeds or some sort of frozen feeds, which of course comes back to the whole biosecurity risk. We also have omnivores, and the beautiful discus on the left. It's not my picture, but I've had discus for years, and I can tell you that during the day they're gentle and beautiful and just nibble on algae here and there. But as soon as the lights go out, they turn into something altogether different, and I've watched them just really do some serious damage to my cardinal tetras. So they're omnivorous fishes, even though they seem peaceful and calm and things like that. They need some real meat in their diet as well. On the bottom right is one of my favorite fish in all of the aquarium hobby. It's a green phantom plecostomus, and most people think of plecos as algae eaters and suckerfish and things like that, but they actually require vegetable and meat-based foods. So it's important that just because your vendor or your pet store that sells you these fish tells you that it's an algae eater, that doesn't mean that he's not going to need other things besides that. So again, it goes back to knowing about your fish. For juvenile feeds, we start with microalgae and rotifers and copepods, brine shrimp or artemia, and you can see that we're growing them in these large cylinders. That's kind of an old picture on the top. Since our population has grown here at the University of Miami, we now use the vats on the bottom to grow even more of these juvenile feeds. The rotifers and copepods and microalgae are critical to the success of growing out new species. In just a second, I'm going to show you a video of some Florida pompano juveniles eating live feeds. You'll see they're getting fed some artemia towards the end of the video. And one thing I want to tell you guys is that I promise you that the video is normal speed despite what it appears. They are the quickest little buggers you've ever seen. So we'll go ahead and show that video. And that tank is about a little over 3,300 gallons, and you can see that there's thousands and thousands of fish in there, and they love to eat. Those little guys are pretty exciting. When it comes to adult feeds, it's a little bit more of a challenge, because again, we go back to being species dependent. And so it's, in general, a good idea to provide multiple fresh foods, so that way you get more of a balanced diet, assuming that you can't feed them pellets or things like that. We do some feed trials where we're trying to get some of our animals onto pelleted diets, but taking a wild animal and converting them to a pelleted diet can be a bit of a challenge, and there's a lot of research involved in that. Ones that we use are typically squid, sardines, shrimp, and herring, but it can be a lot of other things. It can be crabs, can be lobster, lots of other fresh foods depending on the species that you've selected. In this next video I'm going to show, these are our cobia broodstock. So these are pretty large fish. They're anywhere from, I would say, 10 to 30 kilos. I apologize in advance for the camera kind of going in and out of the water. The problem is with cobia, they're very excitable fish. They're like a bunch of puppies, and they will attack anything. They'll attack a camera. They'll attack a dissolved oxygen meter. If you drop your pencil in there, they will attack that. They will attack your hand. They will attack anything that moves. They're pretty exciting. And in this particular video, you'll see they're being fed whole fish. But again, I apologize for the camera coming in and out of the water. They're just trying not to lose the GoPro. So in that video, you can see there's probably 10 or 12 adult cobia in there, and they do really well together. I mean, that's part of their nature. And in a moment, I'll show you some mahi-mahi, which have different behaviors. Cobia tend to be, although they do go around Florida and they do travel quite a bit, they hang around structures and they come in schools very oftentimes. But the mahi-mahi you'll see are very different. So in this video, we're going to be feeding some mahi, some squid, but I want you to notice the number of fish per tank. And the reason that is a big bull or a big male mahi will easily kill other male mahi and oftentimes kill female mahi. So you really have to find the delicate balance between the right number of animals and then the ability to breed. So it's a bit of a challenge, but you'll see that there's only a couple of them in this giant tank. And this is an 80-ton tank, so it's 22,000 gallons, and look at how many fish we have in there. So let's go ahead. So even that big male came over to check us out. They're quite an amazing species, and unfortunately, we're working on ways to be able to have more of them per tank and work on some of the aggression issues. But you know, that's the way that they live. They live in deep water. And although they like structure and they do school, there's plenty of space for fish to get away from each other in the natural habitat, as opposed to the cobia, which are typically a more shallow species and don't have the same options to escape the big bad macho man. So with these unusual species, we talk about where we get them from. What are our sources? Well, aquaculture is obviously a great place to start, and a lot of species are grown, maybe not in your area, but they're grown somewhere, and aquaculture is ideal. But if not, then you can go with wild caught, and sometimes the investigator is the one that can catch them. However, when it comes to regulations, we want to make sure that the PIs have the right permits. And this is something that we ask for in our protocol reviews, is permits and special activity licenses. It's a state of Florida thing, and just to make sure that they're not in protected areas or getting protected species or anything like that, to help both the investigator and the university stay compliant with legal regulations. And then, you know, when the PI catches them, how are they catching them? Are they catching them by net, by hook and line versus a fish trap? All of those have different levels of potential pain and distress, as Dr. Ramos also touched on earlier today. One way that we've also gotten fish is purchasing from professional local fishermen. I specifically underline professional because you don't want the guys that are sitting on top of the bridge yanking up whatever they catch. That's not an acceptable way to collect animals. However, the fishing guides really know their stuff, and they can go out, they know where the fish are, they know where they are in different times of the season, and most likely they have the ability to bring that animal back to you in a very high, in a very safe and professional way, as opposed to, you know, some guy with a bucket on the side of the road. And then in other scenarios, you can purchase from aquatic importers. Lots and lots of fish are bred overseas, particularly in Asia. But of course, when you're doing international importation, there are other issues that can arise as well, both with travel and with exotic disease. So that's I would say that's kind of a lower on my options list. But some other planning considerations when you're building a new facility is how many studies are going to utilize this infrastructure. Again, it's not worth spending hundreds of thousands of dollars for a short-term study with one PI. There are ways to make temporary facilities, right, and to accommodate PIs. But if you're going to build a large facility and really try to incorporate that into your university or into your institution, some things you got to worry about or think about is who's going to manage this. And I don't mean just the fish, but the infrastructure. And do you have the people that know how to fix the equipment? Do they understand how water works in these situations? And who's gonna be able to fix that water pump on Christmas Eve when it breaks down? So that's an important thing. And then, of course, who's going to manage the animals? This is always a big debate when it comes to the veterinary side and the husbandry side, because a lot of veterinarians don't have experience with aquatics, and so you've got to decide who's going to manage those animals from a health perspective as well. And then, of course, is the facility cost effective? And that's when I talk about permanent versus temporary. So there are lots of aquaculture pools. They look like little pop-up pools that you get for your children, and you can turn that into a very successful aquaculture setup that you could take down when not in use. We talk about housing systems. They're very similar, again, between freshwater and marine systems. We've got a flow-through system, which most people know about. It's kind of water in to the fish and then water out. Not a whole lot of filtration is going on in the actual tank itself. It's just a fresh supply of clean water. And we have that at the university. We also have recirculating systems. And recirculating systems are very, very classic. That's what you see with Xenopus systems and fish stores and most people's personal aquariums, things like that. So recirculating is very common. And especially in areas where you don't have an overabundance of salt water, you really have to go with a recirculating system. But you can use the same equipment and the same set up the sump and the pump, and everything can be the same for a recirculating system both in freshwater and in saltwater. Sometimes there's a mix of both, and we have that as well. And then one other housing system we'll talk about in just a second is aquaponics. I won't touch too much on that, but I'll show you some things that we're doing here at the university. This is a picture of a classic flow-through system. There'll be a video after this slide I'll show you. But in this particular picture, you can see these are juvenile cobia that are probably, if I had to guess, a couple of months old. And they're swimming against the current. As you can see, they're all kind of pointed in the same direction. The white PVC in the center is the standpipe, and what that does is that controls the depth of the water. So if you were to pull that out, all of the water will disappear. It will go down, and that allows you to do a couple of things. One, when the fish are not there, it allows you to empty the system very quickly and easily and clean it for the next round. It also allows you to put a different height PVC pipe in there, so that way if you had to treat the animals with an anesthetic or any sort of chemical, you can lower the amount of water, so therefore you lower the use of the drug that you're trying to utilize on those animals. In a second, I'm going to show you a video of some baby mahi-mahi. You've already seen the mom and dad, but we've got a bunch of juveniles inside, and what's interesting is you can see some of that male aggressive behavior actually even when they're this size. And so sometimes we have to remove some of the larger, more aggressive males even when they're very young, because they're just tough guys, and they can become problematic. But you'll see the standpipe right in the middle. That's the PVC, and you'll see the water flow as well. And that's a very typical setup for us and for a lot of other aquaculture facilities. So please, I'll show that. To me, they're gorgeous. They're really amazing, and the colors that you see are the videos don't do it justice. When you see them up close and in real life, they're stunning. Even when they're less than an inch, the colors really just bounce out of them, and they're gorgeous animals. But you can see in that video that that standpipe is what controls the height of the water, and all the water's flowing down the other side, inside of that PVC pipe. Recirculating systems, which we touched on before, they don't have to be small aquarius type or Xenopus housing type. They can be these gigantic vats. And the videos you saw earlier of the cobia and the mahi broodstock, our large animals, they're in these giant tanks, and we've got sand filters, we've got a heater chiller mechanism, we've got all kinds of filtration going on. So that system is totally a recirculating system, and that tank has its own recirculating system, so it's all enclosed in one. Whereas in this next slide, you'll see that this is kind of more analogous to our other species and pet stores, where you've got multiple tanks that are on the same water system. They're all connected. You can't see the filter in this particular picture, but they're all connected. So that has its own issues, in the sense that if there's a disease outbreak in one tank, you've got a disease outbreak in all tanks. But it also allows one filter to control all of those different tanks. Here's a quick picture of our aquaponic system at the marine campus. In the very bottom white vat, we've got blue tilapia. And the whole idea of aquaponics is that as you feed the fishes, they produce nitrogenous wastes. And nitrogenous wastes are just what basil and tomatoes and things like that love to eat. So we actually produce quite a bit of our food for the cafeteria over there, or at least some of the greens from the cafeteria, in aquaponic systems. So it's kind of a unique way, and I think it's pretty cool, and I think it's really going to be kind of a wave of the future when it comes to food production, because it allows you to kind of maximize production of both plants and fishes at the same time. When we talk about water quality parameters and testing, again, completely species dependent. You got to know what you're dealing with. And the parameters tested and the frequency really depends on the type of system you've chosen. Flow through is different than recirculating, and what you need to look for and where your water's coming from. One thing that we have done at the University of Miami to kind of make things a little easier for us is that in our IACUC protocols, we ask the PI to talk about their water quality testing and their frequency. And what that allows us to do is, should the PI deviate from that in a negative way, that gives us, our IACUC or oversight body, the ability to get involved and have a little more oomph, and get them on board to do what they say they're going to do. But one thing I want to remind people is that oftentimes with these exotic species, the PIs are often the experts. You know, they have been studying the Florida pompano for 25 years. They know more about it than anybody else. So it's really important that we have their input, and we have to have a really congenial relationship with our aquatic PIs and the IACUC and the veterinary staff, so that way you know, we're on the same team, because they really know what they're doing. We may know the regulations, but they know the biology of the fishes. And when it comes to water quality parameters and testing, you know, it's not always uniform between PIs and systems. So we have lots of different options, if you will, depending on the system that you're running here at the university. Again, when we talk about IACUC and oversight body compliance, it's challenging because most IACUC members don't know anything about aquatics, and it's a natural thing. One thing that has been a hot topic for us is, how do we characterize pain and distress? Is capture, collection, and travel distressful? We have determined that you know, it is potentially distressful to pull a fish from the bottom of the ocean with a hook in its mouth. So we actually use the USDA pain and distress categories, and for wild caught fishes like that, we call them a category E. But at a local, at a recent IACUC 101-301, I asked this particular question, and the answer was, well, why are you using the USDA pain and distress categories anyway? So that's a good point. So you don't actually have to use those categories, but for the University of Miami, we do use the USDA pain and distress categories for all of our animals, despite their lack of USDA oversight. Just to make it easier on everybody, but we personally have considered wild collection for the most part to be category E, or potentially distressful, as you can imagine. So again, advantageous to have water quality testing regimens stated in the protocol, and it's also important that the PI documents mortalities. We would ask the same sort of thing of a mouse producer or you know, mouse user, just so we have an idea of where we're at in terms of numbers, and we can identify when there are mass mortalities or some maybe even a slow, steady increase in mortality of animals. However, one thing I will warn you is that expect some pushback from the aquatic scientists as our regulations for laboratory animal care increases. You know, I talked on one of the first slides about how aquatics are a bigger part of our regulations now, and a lot of aquatic scientists are not used to being told kind of what to do and what they have to do. So it's not the easiest thing, but I think with some mutual respect, it can be a very positive relationship. But they just need to understand that you know, if you're using animals at the university, you fall under the guidance of the IACUC, and we need to keep them in regulatory compliance. When it comes to management issues, who's responsible for what? Again, that's important. Per diems can be a nightmare because facilities have multiple different PIs, they have different systems, and differing levels of involvement. Some PIs will do 100% of their animal care, and we have some PIs that really want to be hands-off, and they'll allow our staff to do it. So calculating per diems is really a hassle. Like I said, different systems. You know, a recirculating system has consumables. It has filter pads. It has charcoal. It has UV sterilizing bulbs, things like that. Whereas some of the flow-through systems don't have that. And so it's a challenge to get the right per diems for your facility. And again, other management issues, predators and pests. It's critical to know your local laws. You know, I would say one of our biggest potential predators are wading birds. You know, a great blue heron or any of these water birds would love to just gobble up a bunch of baby mahi-mahi, but by law we cannot harass or do anything to those birds. So that's why you'll see all of our tanks are covered or are under shade of some sort, so they just don't have access to it. But it's really important that you know your local laws so that you don't potentially harass or cause a problem to, you know, a protected species. Again, we go back to carcass disposal. When we euthanize a 40-pound or 40-kilo, bull mahi, something delicious, we can't just throw it in the dumpster because birds can find that, or homeless folks can find that and may think that they hit the jackpot, and in fact that's a toxic animal. So we do carcass disposal for our large animals, our large fishes, the same way we do with our large animals at the university, and that's commercial incineration. However, you can also donate fish to other facilities. A lot of local aquariums would love to have some fish given to them, as long as they're healthy and free of other problems. So that's something to think about, as long as you have some established parameters for that. Of course, like our rodent species, we also got to worry about environmental monitoring and alarm systems. Temperature is absolutely critical. Just like rodents, they can't get too cold, they can't get too hot. We've got to have redundant heaters and chillers depending on your situation. Of course, you got to have extra parts on hand, and this is the same thing with my home aquarium. My motto is, if it can break, it will, and at the worst time possible. And that has proven itself true more than once, I can promise you that. When it comes to veterinary issues, do you have a veterinarian with experience or knowledge on staff? I mean, that in itself is a hard thing to find. Fortunately, aquatics are a bigger part of veterinary education these days, and a lot of veterinarians are seeking out some of this knowledge. So, and obviously some of you here watching today and in the future are interested in that. So that's a great thing. So we need to improve on that and get more aquatic veterinarians out there. And again, knowledge of the species is absolutely critical. And a lot of these species, the physiologic values are lacking. Nobody knows. I mean, I could draw blood from lots of different fishes, but if we don't know what a normal is, we have no value in that sample. Also, normal appearance and behavior for different species. Is that big mahi just a bully, or are all big male mahi that way? Well, they all are all that way. Again, knowledge of the species, what diseases should you be looking for? And this is very species dependent as well. And then, of course, what diseases are reportable? Because just like in other industries, cattle and things, we do have reportable diseases. And so, fortunately, none of those have ever crept up at the University of Miami, but should they creep up, I would report those to the appropriate authorities. It's also important to have a biosecurity plan, and that involves everything from who enters the facility to how your nets are handled to food intake. There's just lots of different ways that pathogens can enter your facility. So if you've thought about that and made plans, you're ahead of the game. You also can get USDA facility accreditation. Even though these are not USDA covered species, if you're doing mass production, you need to have facility accreditation, and that can be done through USDA APHIS. If you're shipping these animals, whether they be eggs, larvae, whatever, you still need to have the USDA National Veterinary Accreditation Program Category 2 accreditation, and know what you're doing when it comes to international shipping. I always tell people that the veterinarians are the liaison between the researchers and the regulators. Besides being in charge of animal health, we're also in charge of keeping everybody in compliance. And of course, just like with any facility, we should be involved. The veterinary team should be involved in planning new construction. Talk about research opportunities. You can do aquaculture for food production, pet production, research animal production, and direct biomedical research. When we come to food fishes, our brood stock are our most valuable and critical animals. Those are the ones that are the oldest and the hardest to replace. And just keep in mind that it can take more than a year for some of these seasonally breeding fishes. And it can take multiple years because you've got a lot of steps to accomplish. You've got to produce viable eggs, so they've got to hatch. You've got to feed larvae and get those larvae to grow, and the F1s to become sexually mature, and then try to breed the F1s. So it can take a number of years for a species that perhaps you're not used to. We typically ship eggs and larvae, sometimes juveniles, and that's mostly because it's a lot cheaper to ship 100,000 eggs than it is to ship just 5 giant broodstock cobia or something like that. But whenever you're shipping fish, you got to remember that you got to adhere to drug and chemical withdrawal times, which are, excuse me, which are established in the literature. And of course, you need USDA veterinary inspection for shipment. And if you're doing mass production, you need to have an aquaculture site accreditation from the USDA. You need to know and respect the current regulations of the importing country if international. And this is really important, and I underline current because oftentimes the regulations appear as soon as you ask the country what your regulations are. And I've got some funny stories to tell people offline where regulations didn't exist until I asked about them. When you get really good at it, sometimes it's easier to work at it with a third party to sell those fishes. For pet production, it's similar to food fish, but they're typically smaller species. There's a little bit less concern about drug selection and withdrawal times because these are not food animals, but you still need USDA veterinary inspection for export. You still need site accreditation if you're going to be a mass producer of these animals. I say when in doubt, write a health certificate. It never hurts to write a health certificate after you've examined those animals. And if you have questions, contact the USDA APHIS office. They're the experts. Research animal production is, again, highly dependent on species selected. You can have invertebrates or vertebrates. But even if you have invertebrates, you still need USDA veterinary inspection for international export. And you still need USDA aquaculture site accreditation for mass production, even for some aplesia, which I'll talk about in a second. For direct biomedical research, these fishes and animals are used for tumor studies, auditory research, physiologic testing, genetics of wild populations, interactions between species, behavioral research, and some pollution studies, both short and long term. It's kind of endless when it comes to biomedical research. In this particular picture, you can see it's a little bit tough, but in the middle, you can see a bicolored damselfish. We use those for tumor studies. Unfortunately, we got to keep them separated because they're highly aggressive with each other, but they're used for tumor studies, and they're in a traditional recirculating system. This is our brand new facility, and you can see there's many of them in here, and all this water is recirculated. Another fish that we've used here at the University of Miami, this is photos from my friend Dr. Liu. This is the jade goby, and these are used a lot for auditory research. I used to inspect his facilities a lot, and I fell in love with the fish so much that I have one in my own tank. And the one in my own tank is about 4 times the size of the ones that you see on the left. They're really groovy fish, and they're fun to watch. They have unique behavior, but they're using auditory research, and most people wouldn't think that fishes are using auditory research. So just a moment, I'm going to show you a young mahi that's in a swim chamber. And a swim chamber can measure physiologic responses. We can count opercular movements, and that can give us some estimation of O2 consumption. It's oftentimes related with images that are captured by a high-speed computer, and we can do analyses later. We can change the water from quick to slow. We can change temperature, salinity, all kinds of parameters, and see the effect. Or we can expose them to potential pollution or potential toxins, things like that. The way we manage it is that we kind of make it analogous to using a treadmill in mice and rats. So it's the same sort of idea. So you'll see this little mahi swimming his tail off, so to speak. So go ahead. So, like I said, that was a quick video, but you can see we can see that animal, and we can do a lot of analyses with high-speed computers. We also are, the University of Miami is a National Resource Center for Aplesia. Aplesia is the California sea hare, and they're used a lot in neuroscience. And we are the NIH's National Center for Research Resources with this species. Here's some pictures of our setup. On the upper left is an adult Aplesia californica. They can get to be about the size of a football, so they're quite impressive when they're big. You can see in the other pictures our setups. And of course, there are no real commercial setups for these, so some of you may recognize the polycarbonate rat cages that are used in the pictures. So we're doing internal recycling of our rat cages to facilitate this project. On the bottom right, as you can see, that's where we're growing the babies out from the eggs. So it's a pretty cool setup, and we're real happy about that and real proud of that facility. And the reason that we're so good at it is because we've got sun and we've got seaweed, so we can do this better than anybody. And that's just a picture of vats that are containing nothing but seaweed that our aplysia eat like it's candy. So wrapping up, some resources that are available to you from a diagnostic sense. I've utilized the University of Florida USDA APHIS, has a lot of information for aquaculture. If you're not in Florida, contact your agricultural college extension offices. That's what they're there for. There's also professional internet fish veterinary groups like the Association of Fish Veterinarians. And when in doubt, contact your local veterinary school, and they can help point you in the right direction if you want to do some advanced diagnostics, maybe some PCR, some virology, things like that. So takeaway points are: you can do it. It doesn't take an expert. You can become an expert very quickly, and as long as you plan ahead of time before your study and know your species, you're really ahead of the game. And our aquatic systems share a lot of the same similarities between marine and freshwater facilities. So you may have a lot of experience with, zebrafish, third time I've said it. And if so, that's fine. You can easily use a lot of that same experience and same knowledge base to do pretty much any marine species, so long as you do your homework beforehand. But just remember that there are often little data on most of our non-traditional species, and sometimes the PI is the expert. So it's important that we work together with them and have a real positive relationship with them. So just some quick acknowledgments. Thanks to Dr. Julia Zayas, my director here at the Division of Veterinary Resources, Dr. Dan Benetti, he's the director of aquaculture here at the University of Miami. Lots of aquaculture folks, especially Ron and John, have been just totally awesome and helped me out a lot. And my mentor, Dr. Roy Yanong, at the Tropical Aquaculture Laboratory at the University of Florida. In that picture you can see those are, we call them the A-team, that's our aquaculture team, and we're quite proud of their accomplishments, they're just an outstanding group of individuals. So thank you very much. Appreciate your time. We'll take some questions in a second. And again, this is a picture of the Keys in February. So sorry about everybody who's not, or who's battling the snow, I should say. So I think.
Thank you very much, Dan, for that great presentation. Before we get started on the question and answer session, I would like to remind our audience how to submit questions. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found by clicking on the green Q&A button at the lower left of the presentation window. And we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. Our first question we have from the audience is, I know this might not be related, but do you know if there is a strategy to exterminate the lionfish? I understand it is quite invasive and it is negatively impacting the fishing industry.
There's lots of different ideas out there. But really, at this point, I think it's just manual removal. I think that a lot of people are very nervous and very scared because in the Atlantic, this is an apex predator, and they're eating lots of reef fishes, and I don't think that the field really understands everything about how the lionfish has adapted to the Atlantic. They're from the Pacific, and they're a colder water species, but they seem to have tolerated being here. But their ability to tolerate cold water allows them to go a lot deeper. So I'm not sure that there's a real good plan out there, and I think that the wildlife folks are really nervous about it, to be honest with you.
Great. We do have another question. At what point do you think it would be appropriate to grow your own live feed for adult animals? It would eliminate your concerns for biosecurity.
I would say that you know, we grow our own foods for obviously for the juveniles. I don't think it would be particularly cost effective for the large fishes. It could be done, but it would be very labor intensive, and most people don't have the space to grow out the sheer numbers that we would need. You know, in our case, so I think you're really kind of stuck with these bait producers, but you know, if perchance you found a disease outbreak, or you were concerned about that, or if, you know, you had a smaller population of animals, that's totally reasonable to do. But if you're going to be feeding live fish to other fish, that's something that your IACUC needs to know about and needs to make some decisions on, because getting eaten alive, I think, would be potentially distressful.
Okay, our next question. If you have a large sick fish and you collect a blood sample for analysis, do you have to process that sample yourself, or can you send it to a contract lab?
You can send it to a contract lab. I mean, you can do some processing yourself. It really depends on you know, your facilities. I mean, I'm at a medical school, so I have a little bit more options in other places. But you could certainly collect blood and then ship it. You know, the key is to talk to the laboratories beforehand and have some communication with them for exactly what their capabilities are and what they would want. But certainly you can do your own processing as well. But depending on what your institution's capabilities are, for the most part, you know, medical schools don't have a lot of the PCR primers and things that you would need for fishes. But if you're at a veterinary school or something like that, then you may have an internal laboratory that would work. But there are a lot of third-party laboratories that can really help you out in that situation. So it kind of depends on what you're doing and where you're at.
Okay, and we have our last question. You refer to biosecurity a lot with the animals. Do you believe this is equally important when it comes to selecting your water source?
Yes and no. I certainly, you know, I would prefer if I could make my own water, but you know, it's definitely a concern. We have had outbreaks of external parasites before from incoming water. That's happened on a couple of occasions, but for the most part, we don't have that issue. You know, it is a potential risk, but it's something that we monitor regularly for, and if we were to have an outbreak of a particularly viral disease or something like that, we would easily be able to isolate the affected animals and then test them and potentially eradicate that pathogen. But certainly it's a concern. You know, my biggest concern is external parasites, because they're so prevalent. And the other thing, you know, it's not quite biosecurity, but with incoming water is you know, there could be a toxin spill. You saw the slide where the collection is out in the bay. There could be some yahoo that decides to dump oil or gasoline out of his boat right there, and then that could potentially get to our fishes. But that's the things that worry me the most. So biosecurity a little bit, but you know, it's kind of difficult when you're pushing, you know, hundreds of thousands of gallons a day. So it can be a bit of a challenge.
Thank you, Dr. Rothen. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank the audience for their interesting questions and their participation in today's event. And thank you, Dr. Rothen, for all of your excellent videos and pictures. Today's webcast will be available for on-demand viewing through August 2015, and you'll receive an email from LabRoots alerting you to when this webcast will be available for replay. We invite you to pass this announcement along to your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. That's all for now. Goodbye, and see you next time.